Hi, everybody. If you're sitting comfortably, as they say, then we'll begin. My name is Olivia O'Leary. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster. And we're going, and a lot of people I know are looking forward to it, to hear from one of the few people who can probably give a lot of straight answers about what's happening in Iraq and Syria in particular. Patrick Cockburn, as many of you know, was born in Cork. He spent 3 years as a research student in Queen's University in the early 70s, but he's been a Middle East correspondent since 1979 for the Financial Times and now for the London Independent. His work has won him many awards. I'm not going to mention them all. I'm just going to mention last year's Foreign Commentator of the Year at the Editorial Intelligence Comment Awards and Foreign Affairs Journalist of the Year at this year's British Journalism Awards, or rather 2014's. Over the years, he's written a number of books about Iraq. He's written 2 books about the jihadist movement, Islamic State. The Jihadis' Return, ISIS and the New Sunni Uprising was published last year and is still available from the publishers. The publishers are?
Or books,
or books.
Online, or in all good and some bad bookshops from about a week's time.
And the new book is called The Rise of Islamic State, ISIS and the New Sunni Revolution. And they describe how Islamic State was able to set up its own state in northern Iraq and eastern Syria. And that's what he's going to talk to us about this afternoon. Patrick will talk for about 15 minutes, then he and I will chat a bit about it, and then we'll open it to the floor. So would you welcome Patrick Cockburn?
Well, thank you very much. I got to talk for about not very long about the Islamic State, about which one could talk endlessly. I won't do that. But it is one of the most extraordinary and surprising events, to my mind, in modern history, because this organization seemed to come from nowhere. In early June last year, most governments in the world thought that Iraq was a sort of embattled place, a very corrupt place, but that it had reached a sort of rather violent stability. Then they discovered that this group they'd hardly heard of, which is sometimes called ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which means the Levant, basically Greater Syria, had, with about 1,300 fighters, taken over Mosul, which is the second biggest city in Iraq, which was meant to be defended by 60,000 Iraqi troops. Actually, there were only about 20,000 Iraqi troops there because the Iraqi army partly consists of ghost soldiers whose salaries are paid, but they're taken by the officers and officials, and sort of semi-ghosts where the soldiers do exist, but they pay off the officers not to go anywhere near the barracks. I mentioned this early on because when we're looking at why the Islamic State grew so explosively over the last year, one of the reasons is the dysfunctional nature of the Iraqi state. And not just in Iraq. One of the reasons that al-Qaeda-type organizations have been able to expand so fast everywhere from Iraq to Yemen to northeast Nigeria is the weakness of the states which they've been combating. Then, in the middle of last year, ISIS conducted a series of lightning, almost sort of Napoleonic military campaigns in which they first defeated the Iraqi army. They captured Mosul on the 10th of June. They took most of northern and western Iraq. They inflicted a series of defeats on the Syrian army and on the other Syrian rebels. They took an area which very rapidly is about the same size as Great Britain and declared their caliphate in that area. And then the Iraqi Kurds, the Peshmerga, who were meant to be much tougher fighters, when they were attacked last August, they almost immediately collapsed and ran away. This brought the intervention of the US and started bombing in Iraq on the 8th of August and Syria on the 23rd of September. But this hasn't actually made a decisive difference. So why did ISIS manage to win these victories? I mean, it is an appalling organization. It's what an Afghan journalist in Kabul called holy fascists. These are people of extreme violence, of extreme sectarian views, people who believe women should be, have a status almost as certainly as chattels, almost as semi-slavery. Yet it's been very effective. It's basically a fighting machine we're talking about. And part of the reason for its growth is the fact that it's been victorious. I mean, success builds on success, particularly for people, young men in that area, Sunni Arab young men, unemployed, miserable life. Suddenly there's this organization that can defeat their enemies, that can give them a job. We can go into that a bit later. But the basic reason for their success is that they combine fanaticism, religious fanaticism, with military expertise. The religion comes essentially from Saudi Arabia. It's very like Saudi Wahhabism. Wahhabism is the variant of Islam, which is the state, essentially the state religion of Saudi Arabia, very fundamentalist, very regressive, very sectarian, I said before. Most important, they regard Shia as not as a different type of Muslim, but as a non-Muslim, and not worse than a non-Muslim, heretics who've betrayed the faith and should be killed on all possible occasions. So these are proponents of religious war. I mean, you have to be, one of the reasons they were expelled from Al-Qaeda was their unreasoning violence. And given the nature of Al-Qaeda, that does perhaps give one an indication of just how violent they are. And it's led by people who, you know, ISIS is the child of war. It comes out of these wars in the middle of the long war in Iraq from 2003. These are people who lead it, have been fighting the Iraqi army, but they were fighting the Americans for 10 years. And if you're doing that and you survive, you're probably pretty good at your job. There are some former officers from Saddam's time with military professionalism, but I think the key thing is experience, this fanaticism and military experience of fighting. And in recent months, winning. The other peculiarities about this ISIS is their use of the internet. In 2011, when the Arab Spring started, it was the internet, YouTube, the social media were generally described by journalists as being progressive, that this was great because now people could circumvent the state television in dictatorships in Egypt and elsewhere. This was a brave new world. But of course, all these new means of communication are essentially means of communication. And you can communicate good and you can communicate bad. ISIS was extremely fast in using it to spread their propaganda, which they did very effectively. They also used it in a way which I think is unique, to spread terror. One of the reasons the Iraqi army, the Kurds, all ran away was that ISIS would make these very professional films in which you'd see Iraqi soldiers going to their base, being hauled out of cars, being interrogated, and bang, being shot in the head. Others who are Shia lorry drivers and so forth, they'd show their snipers. ISIS, one of the aspects of their professionalism is they're very big on very highly trained snipers. Snipers lining up their sights on some guy and shooting him. So these very chilling, horrible movies were used to spread terror. The family of every soldier in the Iraqi army would have watched these on the internet and be saying to their son, just don't go back to the army, if there's going to be a battle. So there's this funny mixture of extraordinary, regressive, fanatical religion and ability to use modern means of communication and have a high degree of military expertise. Things like IEDs, basically roadside bombs in vast numbers, booby traps everywhere they've been using. Even just in northern Iraq, even where they've retreated, they leave all these booby traps everywhere. So, there's a torch in some house that they've left. Some Iraqi Peshmerga picks it up, switches it on, bang, but it's full of explosives. These successes gave ISIS a sense of military invincibility, and not only invincibility, but a sense that their victories were divinely ordained. In Iraq, and they grew up originally in Iraq, their sort of almost magical success was the result of this extreme corruption of the Iraqi state. A few days after they'd captured Mosul last year, I was in Baghdad, and I met a recently retired Iraqi four-star general. And I said, well, why did it happen? Why did the army disintegrate like that? And he said, corruption, corruption, corruption. He said, when the Americans were creating this Iraqi army, they outsourced supplies for the army, true to sort of neoliberal economic theory. So this bringing food and other things to the army went to private companies. This had a certain consequence, which is it suddenly became the interest of the colonel of a battalion. There he is getting money for 600 soldiers in his battalion. But it's much in his interest if there are only 150 soldiers in that battalion, and then he can pocket the other money for the food for the other 450 soldiers. And that was the state of the Iraqi. There are lots of other ways of making money that, all over Iraq there are checkpoints, military checkpoints. If you're an individual, you can normally get through. But let's say you're driving a truck it's got food or something else going to Baghdad. It's going to cost you $100. All these checkpoints act as almost like customs posts. As a result, nobody became an officer in the Iraqi army without paying for the job. And then, of course, they'd have to make the money back later. If you wanted, you want to be a colonel of a battalion, I'm not quite sure what it is now, but about 6 months ago, it could cost you about $200,000. If you wanted to be commander of a division, it cost you about $2 million. So this was big stuff. And I remember beginning of last year, 2013, I was in Iraq. I was doing a 5-part series for my newspaper on 10 years after the American invasion, and I was talking to an Iraqi Kurdish politician about the army, and he said it's not going to fight. They'll run away. They don't do any training. And I said, surely some of them will fight. And he said, no, Patrick, you don't understand. These aren't soldiers. They're investors. That's why they joined the army. Jump forward to the present day. This hasn't changed much. Even in the last few weeks, the Iraqi army is trying to advance at various points which the Islamic State had taken in Iraq. And they haven't done too badly, but they're not too well either. And one of the reasons is that, divisions that are meant to have 4,000 combat troops maybe have 400, that sort of, it's not really there. And this is very important because the politics of war in Iraq and Syria is shaped not just by military events, it's shaped by political and ethnic considerations. So let's say, take Mosul. This is a Sunni Arab city, second biggest city in Iraq. It's the biggest Sunni city captured by ISIS. A lot of people in Mosul don't like ISIS because it's blown up their mosques, because they say they are shrines. They're not really mosques because they're insisting that women wear the niqab, that we're not completely covered. So they're pretty angry. But they also wonder what will happen if the Iraqi government retakes Mosul. Now, it might be, if it was the Iraqi army, that they wouldn't be so sectarian, but they're terrified that it could be the Shia militias from Baghdad, who are wholly sectarian, don't really distinguish between Sunni who are members of ISIS and those who are not, and they think will murder all the young men or arrest them, basically they'll ravage the whole place. And they have every reason to think that, because the towns that the Shia militias have taken around Baghdad, the Sunni have either fled, or when they haven't, they get arrested, they get tortured, they get killed. So if there's no Iraqi army, the alternative is these militias, and that means that the local Sunni have no really alternative but to fight for the Islamic State, even if they don't like it. And this is one of the strengths of the Islamic State, is for local people, what is the alternative? In Iraq, is it going to be the militias, the Shia? Is it going to be the Kurds, almost equally bad? In Syria, is it going to be Assad's army, which they're frightened of, Alawites, Shia, and so forth? So they end up, I think, we don't much like these guys, ISIS, but the alternative seems even worse. ISIS also sort of functions as a state in places like Mosul. I mean, things are bad, electricity cut off, people have to rely on private generators, fuel for that's very expensive. But a lot of them want to leave. Some do leave, but then what happens is that guys from ISIS go from house to house in Mosul, and they say, where is the owner? Maybe somebody answered the door and said, oh, I'm looking after it. They said, yeah, show us the owner, documents for the owner. If they find the owner has fled to Baghdad or Kurdistan or Turkey, they say he or she have 10 days to come back here, or we confiscate this house without compensation, give it to somebody else. So by sort of measures like that, they prevent their area being depopulated. They now control an area, as I said, about the size of Great Britain, and they probably has a population of about 5 or 6 million. How many fighters do they have? Well, they've been going from house to house saying, if there's one sort of unmarried young man in the family, one person from every family must come and join our fighting force. You can get off, officially we pay $1,200, the equivalent in Iraqi dinars. But if there are 2 men of sort of fighting age, one of them at least has to join their forces. This means that last September, the CIA said there were 20,000 to 31,500 members of ISIS. I'm always suspicious of people who give sort of precise figures like that. I mean, how do they know? But actually now I think it's far more. It's 100,000 or more, because they've been conscripting more fighters, and they're fighting on many fronts. They couldn't do that without far more than 31,000 fighters. Again, go back to how did this happen? We had this march over Charlie Hebdo in Paris a couple of weeks ago with 40 world leaders leading the march. But one thing you notice about all the leaders is that there's never any sense of responsibility for what happened in Iraq and Syria or Libya. There's no sense that they created the conditions in which ISIS grew, but actually they did. Was the crucial thing. ISIS had sort of you'd had Al-Qaeda in Iraq from 2003, from when the Americans invaded, then it had done quite well, then the Americans suppressed it, had raised the Sunni tribes against it. gone down but never disappeared. But what really brought it back wasn't the departure of the Americans, it was the beginning of the war in Syria. That at that time, Iraqi politicians were saying to me, this is, if the war in Syria goes on, it's going to reignite our civil war. And this is exactly what happened. And the war in Syria went on. You know, why has it gone on so long? Well, partly because America, the West, the Sunni Arab monarchies have supported the idea that Assad must go. But if Assad goes, Assad a bad man, dictator and so forth, who benefits? Actually, it's ISIS and the other al-Qaeda type organizations. So then people like Obama or Cameron or Hollande or the Turks will say, yes, but we're going to install we're going to raise a force of moderate Syrian rebels who will take over. But unfortunately, this force doesn't actually exist. So you end up with a policy of trying to get rid of ISIS, but trying to get rid of ISIS's main opponent at the same time. And this simply isn't going to work. So what we have at the moment is a sort of stalemate in Iraq, with the army and the militias nibbling at the edge of the caliphate, which ISIS declared in June last year, but not, in fact, getting that far. It's sort of, ISIS isn't advancing, but neither is the other side. In Syria, the Syrian army is getting that bit weaker because it's fought out, it's difficult getting new recruits. There's still a lot of jihadis coming in, ISIS basically getting stronger. It has a vast array of enemies. They often have sort of conferences chaired by the American Secretary of State, John Kerry, or somebody like that, 60 nations. But they never actually decide to do very much. So ISIS benefits from the fragmentation and contrary policies of its opponents. And, you know, you have Saudi Arabia and Turkey, they say they were very against ISIS, but it turns out they're equally against Assad, and they may be equally against the Syrian Kurds. So the fragmentation which ISIS benefits from. So, you know, what will be the future? Well, I don't see them going out of business anytime soon. I wish they would. I think this is an appalling thing to happen in the Middle East, because eventually if it means sectarian war will grow, it means that the war will intensify in both these countries, it means it will spread elsewhere. But certainly the international reaction to it is not going to suppress it certainly in the way that reaction is at the moment. So, I mean, sadly, this extraordinary, brutal caliphate, which was declared last year, is becoming a fixture on the map. And it influences everywhere outside. You know, now al-Qaeda is getting stronger in Yemen. People probably don't spend much time thinking about Yemen. But ultimately, this impacts on Europe. You can't there are 7 wars going on in Islamic Muslim countries between Pakistan and Nigeria. You have these events, the shootings in Paris, are really only small sparks coming from these major conflicts. And those sparks will keep coming, and so we're going to have more incidents like this. So ISIS, unfortunately, for the moment, is a fixture on the map, an evil regime, but a fairly permanent one for the moment. Thank you.
It's funny, Patrick, that you should use that metaphor of the sparks from the fire landing in Europe, because I was here last night at a performance of Oh My Sweet Land about Syria, and it was a wonderful performance by Corinne Jaber. But she, at the very end, had a pan full of boiling oil, and she made that comment, you know, at some stage, the spits of oil, the sparks from this fire, are going to land in places that we can't possibly foresee. And I was just wondering whether, looking at what happened in France and the fuss that there was about what happened to the Charlie Hebdo journalists and the police who were killed and whatever, It did bring home to one again, though, the fact that, you know, one American death is worth 4 European deaths, is worth 10 East European deaths, is worth 1,000 Arab deaths. It's almost as though we don't actually take real notice of what's going on until it's brought nearer home.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine who's an expert on Nigeria was saying to me, which he said, why is it, if everybody sort of is all together against terrorism, why aren't they wearing a sort of Je suis Nigeria badges, since 2,000 people had just been massacred by Boko Haram, who are basically the Al-Qaeda organization in northeast Nigeria. So sure, I mean, people are concerned what happens in their own backyard, which is understandable. But I think one of the unfortunate things that has happened is that, you know, people blame Tony Blair and George Bush for what happened in 2003, invasion of Iraq, but somehow Cameron and Sarkozy and, in the background, Obama don't get blamed for what happened in Libya. Now, one could say, sure, Gaddafi, bad man, dictatorship, but what has followed is quite certainly a situation which is basically an anarchy with rival militias fighting, which is absolutely plays into the hands of Al-Qaeda, that they have in Libya and elsewhere created conditions which are fertile soil for the growth of Al-Qaeda type organizations.
But what so do states in the West do? Do they, number one, not interfere? Or when should they interfere? And are there those of them, say particularly France, which has a colonialist past and a very violent one in Algeria, is there more that they should be doing to look back at the inheritance that has left and do more to face up to history?
Well, they could, you know, but they should face up to what they're doing now rather than they did then. I mean, in Britain, there's a sort of kind of obsession with what happened in 2003. Somebody on my newspaper said, Patrick, could you write out 15,000 words what happened in 2003? I said, certainly not. I'll write 15,000 words on what happened in 2011 or what's happening now. But there's not much we can do about 2003. I think that, sorry, remind me what you...
Let's go back to, say, the American and British agreement to intervene in Iraq. I mean, many of us thought it was a mistake at the time, but are we paying the price for that now? Is there never a good...
They destroyed the Iraqi state. I mean, what Iraqis say is that the 1990s, sanctions destroyed Iraqi society, which it did. And then in 2003, they destroyed the state, so no wonder the place is anarchic. But going back to the earlier question of foreign intervention, you know, so often debated in abstract terms, my feeling is this, that, you know, you can conceive of situations, there are situations which foreign intervention plays a positive role, like at Kobani, where the Syrian Kurds were under attack, this town on the Turkish border, by ISIS, who had certainly massacred a lot of them. Finally, the Americans start airstrikes to help the Syrian Kurds to prevent it falling to ISIS, because they couldn't afford to let ISIS win another victory. That's a good thing, but slightly more general, I think it's really quite simple. When foreign countries tend to look after their own interests, when the Americans and the British, particularly above all the Americans, invaded Iraq, they looked after their own interests. Why did they invade Iraq? I mean, there are two things. They invaded Iraq and then they occupied Iraq. They're often put together. Actually, they're a bit different. They invaded Iraq, well, because of 9/11, they wanted to hit back, because the neocons wanted to get rid of Saddam. But if they got rid of Saddam, they thought, hold on a minute, who's going to replace him? They thought, well, the majority in Iraq are Shia. And they look primarily to Iran. So if we get rid of the present regime and the majority start taking over, the Iranians will benefit. So it's much in our interest to occupy the place and control what happens next. Almost immediately, they discovered they couldn't control what happened next, but suddenly they were opposed not only to the Sunni, but to the Shia. The majority were against them. But they looked after their own interests. So my view on generally foreign intervention overall is bad, has negative results, because states foreign countries look after their own interests. And that's true today, and it was, true when Strongbow invaded Ireland, and it was true when Julius Caesar invaded Britain. It's not too surprising. I was in Baghdad when the Americans arrived there in 2003. People write sort of highfalutin stuff about the mistakes the Americans made, but a lot of it was kind of like a looting expedition. There is actually, was a stock market in Baghdad, and the Americans sent a 24-year-old who'd never been involved in stock market before to run it because his family was big in the Republican Party. And it was the same throughout. It was kind of, even the Roman Empire, they had a bit more sense than to do that sort of thing. But it was sort of jobs, plunder, money, the extreme corruption of the Iraqi army. People blame on the Iraqis and so forth at that era. 2005, the entire military procurement budget was stolen, $1.2 billion. But the Americans were kind of running a defense ministry at that time. So either the Americans charged were the stupidest people in the world, or somebody was giving them a cut. So anyway, my point is that imperial regimes tend to act in an imperial and self-interested way. That's, I think, why foreign intervention almost invariably ends up with the country intervened in getting the short end of the stick.
Well, taking the tangled web that there is there now, where should the West start? Is there anything it can do to try to put things right? For instance, the relationship between America and the Saudis, and the extent to which the Saudis are actually fueling this fire, but they're never called on it.
No, I mean, one of the amazing things, 9/11 happened. 15 out of 19 hijackers are Saudis. The American official report says the money for 9/11 came from private donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. But the Americans, because they're allied to Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis are close to a lot of important people in America, absolutely nothing happens there. So they go on doing that. Is America going to change its entire relationship with Saudi Arabia? I doubt it. The Saudis have contracts with America, I think $86 billion of arms contracts. But there are other things, which are quite practical. A lot of the number of the satellite TV stations, I can think of two in particular, based in Egypt but financed by the Saudis and Kuwaitis, pump out sectarian hatred, anti-Shia hatred, pro-jihadi stuff. They've gone on doing that. The Saudi information minister tried to close one of them down last December. He was dismissed in 24 hours. That sort of thing the Americans, the British, could put pressure on, serious pressure, and get reduced. How come that the border between Turkey and Syria is so easy for jihadis to cross backwards and forwards? The Turks say, oh, it's terribly difficult, it's a very nasty country. They have an army about 1 million strong, It's not impossible. But if you read, I sometimes read the blogs of particularly British jihadis, particularly women who are stuck in Raqqa or something, and the Syrian capital of ISIS. They said, yeah, we came to the border post, and yes, they let us through. Then the people on the other side, and we didn't like the look of them. We went round to another border post. This is not a difficult border to cross. So there are practical things they could do, which they haven't done.
Just quickly before I go to the audience, what's the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State? I mean, they're both Sunni organizations.
Yeah, I mean, you had Al-Qaeda of bin Laden, one of a number of jihadi organizations that generally had been involved in the fighting in Afghanistan in the 80s. Then Al-Qaeda becomes of bin Laden. It wasn't really a big organization, hardly an organization at all. But it came together for 9/11. Then in Iraq, you have a slightly separate group led by a guy called Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, Jordanian by origin, had been in Afghanistan, who didn't, believe it or not, didn't like al-Qaeda because he thought it was too moderate. He set up his own organization, very anti-Shia, incredibly violent, killing civilians. 2003, he's killed 2006. That organization, then the Americans get part of the Sunni community to turn against it, buy up the tribes, or some of the Sunni tribes. Never quite disappears. The Americans exaggerated the degree of their success. Then 2010, the two leaders are killed. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the current leader, takes over, organizes it. It's very heavily organized. They produce annual reports. How many suicide bombing broken down into provinces, how many attacks, how many assassinations. It's a very curiously bureaucratic organization, but pretty effective. And then its greatest chance comes in 2011 with the beginning of the war in Syria.
Okay, we'll take questions from the audience. There's somebody there with a roving mic. So if you want to ask a question, would you put your hand up and we'll get a microphone to you. I can see one hand up down here. Maybe we could get a microphone here. Okay.
I was just wondering, you talk about the effectiveness of the Islamic State's efforts online, that the propaganda that they produce is very widely seen and very easy to kind of distribute because of the infrastructure that's there online. Do you think that the companies that own these platforms, mostly in the West, could be doing more to kind of curtail that, to stop that?
I think they could do a certain amount, but I think it's quite difficult to close it down entirely because they keep shifting in the way they do it. And it seems to get through. I don't think it would be a decisive move, and probably of diminishing importance, because now that they have their own caliphate, their own state, they're not quite so dependent on propaganda as they were. If you look at their social media, they say media is half jihad. They're very sort of conscious of it, and all these the movies they make of hostages being executed, Western hostages being executed, they're very keen to dominate the news agenda.
It's an extraordinary mixture, isn't it? That, you know, cutting-edge technology and this medieval approach.
Yeah, the other day you may have seen they're demanding $200 million for 2 Japanese hostages. Why do they say $200 million? Not probably because they expect $200 million, but because they know that'll immediately make headlines in the rest of the world. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's, they do think of things like that.
Yeah. Now, there was somebody with her hand up here. Yes.
Hello. I was wondering if you have, there's been a lot of, with the discussion at the moment about kind of, you've got this anti-immigration talk about the Islamization of communities, was a Birmingham, for instance, or I was wondering what your opinion would be as to the nature of the integration of Islam, the Islam communities in the West, and if there is anything that we could be doing or looking at that might be relevant to, we'll say, importing jihadism into the West, or if you know what I mean.
No, I take your point, yeah. I think, it's perfectly reasonable for the police, for security forces, to see who is putting out propaganda in mosques or what organizations there are connected with sending people to Syria or jihadism in general. But I think it very easily mutates into a sort of general anti-Islamic front. I mean, there's, Britain went on about, some school governors in Birmingham. Yeah, okay, maybe they want to push their particular beliefs, but it doesn't necessarily mean they plan to kill anybody. But what I find irritating and frustrating is the same people who do that, are they really, or would they go to the Saudi ambassador in London and say, look, people in your country are supporting television stations that are pumping out hatred, that are encouraging people to, go on jihad, that are denouncing Shia as heretics and so forth. Are they really going to say that to the ambassador or the next visiting Kuwaiti prime minister? They certainly are not, so it's a very soft option which appears that they're doing something, and really they're not doing very much.
But that's extraordinary. I mean, say if you're the president of France and you've just lost 17 citizens in this shootout, it's going to make you feel a little bit differently about the states that are financing this sort of jihadism, isn't it?
Ought to.
Yeah.
But does it? Because, governments quite like a measurable threat against them, because that increases their authority if they can stand tall as defending the community. I think Hollande has moved, from 21% approval to 42% approval since this event, without actually doing anything very much, but being sort of Mr. France in the face of this. And, the same with George W. Bush in 2001. I think successful terrorism requires a certain complicity of politician and leadership on the other side, that they take advantage of this to increase their own authority, to stand tall, then to take measures which are often communal punishment of a whole community, which in fact plays exactly into the hands of the Al-Qaeda. That's exactly what they want, is to provoke an overreaction. This, I think, is integral to the success of any act of terrorism. And it's a fairly obvious thing, trap, but there it is.
Yeah, and Bush used it to great effect in his period as president. George Bush
but
Jr.
Politically, it makes sense. You win elections.
Yeah.
Everybody feels a bit frightened. You're defending the little house on the prairie against these very bad guys. The problem is he didn't actually, the war on terror, they sort of didn't do it. Pakistan is the main supporter. Pakistan Military Intelligence, ISI, is the main supporter of the Taliban. This is kind of well known. They don't put much pressure on Pakistan, but that's kind of serious. 180 million Pakistanis, nuclear power. Much better to sort of go and invade Afghanistan. And we don't do anything to the Saudis, but we go into Iraq, which has nothing to do with 9/11. So you can, they think, great, we can actually, our political agenda can be implemented. But of course, what they rather forget, actually there are real terrorists out there. Despite all the bombast about the war on terror, they actually sort of didn't, it's a bit like the war on drugs, They're quite happy to have that war go on.
But just to go back to the questioner's point about Islamic communities in Birmingham and in other places, and you have terrible things like Fox News coming on and saying that there are whole Islamic areas of Paris that are no-go areas. I mean, ridiculous sort of rubbish.
It's obviously Al-Qaeda runs Fox News. I think we can accept that as a fairly given fact.
Indeed. But going back to the point about particular Muslim communities, what do you do? I mean, if you know that there are imams in certain mosques who are, preaching what approaches to jihadism, do you move in on that, or are you going to be accused of having a heavy-handed approach to the Islamic community? There are sensitivities there.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a question of choice at the time, not always easy choices, but you obviously don't leave people entirely alone who are saying, who are encouraging jihadism of that kind. And it's reasonable that security services should want to do something about that. But they themselves say, that is sort of one that they can't really stop it, because it's really what drives it, what fuels it, is what's happening in these different wars that we've spoken about.
Yeah. So that's where you start.
Well, you do both. But I think that, it's not enough to do that, that you need. At the moment you have security policies, we look at the local imam of the mosque. Then we have political policies which actually sort of, if anything, help the Syrian war go on by saying Assad must go, but in fact he's the main opponent of ISIS, and in any case he isn't going to go because he controls, there are 14 Syrian provincial capitals. He holds 13 of them. Is it likely he's just going to resign one day? This isn't going to happen.
And Iran is backing him?
Iran is backing him, and Russia is, and so forth, and this is a Sunni-Shia civil war as well. So that isn't going to happen. So if we say that's the condition for peace, is that he should transition to leave, we're actually saying the war can go on.
Yeah. Another question. Yes, there's a hand up here.
Olivia, we might have to make this the last question.
Okay.
Thank you.
A lot of observers are saying that this is a build-up to a third world war. I'd like your comments on that.
I don't think so, no. I mean, why should that be? I mean, one thing that people say, you know, is the clash of civilizations. Fantastic rubbish. I mean, most of these wars are within the Islamic world, you know. It's not between Christians and Muslims or the West and the East. Most of these are essentially civil wars in which the Western powers may participate. So I don't think there's going to be a Third World War or anything like that. But I do think that it means, you know, the world is going to get more violent. But some of the ingredients of what's happening in the Middle East are not exclusive. They're social, economic, as well as religious. You know, what are the hardest, toughest rebel areas in Syria? Well, actually, there are areas that used to be Ba'athist government supporters, which are sort of poor villages, poor country areas, shanty towns on the edge of cities. The government used to sort of give people jobs and control prices. Then when we had kind of neoliberal free market economics in the 90s, they stopped doing that. We had supposedly free market economics, but actually it was sort of crony capitalism at the center, and the rest of the country could do what it wanted. So there's a very big social element of the people who have really nothing left in eastern Syria. And nobody... Before 2011, there was a 4-year famine in eastern Syria. This got practically unreported by anybody. 2 or 3 million Syrians moved to shanty towns in the city. A lot of these people are who are rebels now, who lost everything. So there's a strong sort of social element as well. But that sort of violence, I think, is going to grow, and not just in the Middle East. But a Third World War, no, I don't see why that should happen.
Patrick, a last and a very easy question. What's going to happen in Iraq and what's going to happen in Syria?
I know the answers to that, and I shall now tell you, but very quickly. Unfortunately, the war is going to go on because it's a stalemate, because the Islamic State, it's difficult to see it collapsing in Iraq or Syria. It's difficult at this rate to see it going down, why should it go down this year, or indeed next year, unless things change. So we're going to have this sort of festering war go on. But when wars don't get confined within national territory, they spread. They have their influence on neighboring countries. So unfortunately, you know, I really would give anything for the prediction to be wrong, that this war is going to go on and it's going to get worse.
In both Syria and Iraq?
Yeah, but it's the same.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons the government's got it wrong, that some of them knew about Iraq, some of them knew about Syria, but very few of them knew about both. But the Islamic State, or despite its great array of enemies, these enemies are so divided, have such contradictory policies, that they're not putting on the kind of pressure that would lead it to implode. And these guys are very tough, very violent, and are building up their forces still. So that's why I think that they're going to be a fixture for the moment.
Patrick Cockburn, thank you very much.